In the summer of 1324, a man walked into the city of Cairo and accidentally broke its economy. He did not invade it, he did not tax it, he did not tax it, he did not raise a single sword. He simply gave away gold. So much gold, so casually, to so many strangers that the price of gold in Egypt collapsed and stayed collapsed for the next 12 years. He was the richest human being who has ever lived, and he wrecked a continent's money by being generous. His name was Musa. History remembers him as Mansa Musa, the 9th ruler of the Mali Empire of West Africa. And the strangest thing about him is not how rich he was, although the number will genuinely break your sense of scale. The strangest thing is that the wealthiest man in human history ruled an empire that medieval Europe did not even know existed. A sophisticated state, larger than Western Europe, sitting on top of so much gold that it supplied roughly half the gold circulating in the entire medieval world. And almost nobody taught you a single word about it. Let's walk through how one man's kindness crushed the value of money across a dozen nations. First, a level set, because you cannot understand the man without understanding the machine he sat on top of. In the year 1312, when Musa came to the throne, the Mali Empire was already one of the largest states on the planet. It stretched across an estimated 2,000 miles of West Africa, from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, covering parts of what are now a dozen modern countries. It governed millions of people, hundreds of cities and towns, and a standing army that some sources number in the hundreds of thousands. It had a tax system, it had a civil administration, it had universities, and it had something every other power on earth desperately wanted and could not get enough of: gold. Here is a fact that reorganizes everything. In the 14th century, before the silver of the Americas flooded into the old world, gold was the foundation of money across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And the single largest source of that gold, by a wide margin, was West Africa. The gold fields of Bambak, Bur, and the Upper Niger produced an estimated half of all the gold in circulation across the entire medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world. Every gold coin minted in Venice, in Florence, in Cairo, in Damascus had a real chance of having begun its life as dust panned out of a river in the Mali Empire. Now sit with the asymmetry of that. Europe ran on West African gold, and Europe had almost no idea where it came from. The trade crossed the Sahara Desert, one of the most lethal barriers on the planet, in camel caravans that took 2 to 3 months to cross. The gold changed hands through layers of Berber and Arab middlemen in North Africa. By the time a European merchant in Genoa touched the coin, the source was a rumor wrapped in a legend. Some European maps simply labeled the southern edge of the known world with a phrase like, "Here the gold grows," as if it were a crop. So the Mali Empire was, in effect, the central bank of the medieval world, hidden behind the largest desert on earth. It controlled the supply of the metal that everyone else used to define value itself. And in 1312, a man inherited that throne who would, 12 years later, walk that wealth out of the desert and into the streets of Cairo in such quantity that the world finally saw what had been hiding behind the sand. Now we get to the man and to the number that no other number in history can touch. Mansa Musa came to power around 1312 in a way that tells you something about how confident this empire was. According to the accounts, his predecessor, a ruler named Abubakar II, became obsessed with discovering what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. He is said to have outfitted a fleet of hundreds of ships, sailed west into the open ocean, and never returned. Musa, who had been left as deputy, simply inherited the throne. Think about the wealth required to send a fleet over the western horizon as a personal curiosity and absorb the loss without it mattering. That was the empire Musa now ruled. Now, the wealth, modern attempts to estimate Mansa Musa's fortune are, frankly, a guessing game, because the medieval economy does not convert cleanly into modern dollars. But every serious attempt arrives at the same conclusion. He was not merely the richest man of his era. He was so rich that historians describe his wealth as, quote, indescribable, and, quote, beyond imagination. The figures most often thrown around place his fortune, in modern terms, north of $400 billion, which would make him richer than any modern billionaire, richer than the Rockefellers, richer than the medieval Medici, richer than anyone whose wealth we can actually count. But the dollar figure misses the real point. Modern billionaires are rich in stocks, in companies, in numbers on a screen that would evaporate if they tried to sell all at once. Mansa Musa was rich in the actual physical substance that defined money for the entire civilized world. He did not own shares in a thing that made gold. He owned the gold and the land it came from, and the armies that protected it, and the trade routes that carried it. His wealth was not an abstraction. It was a literal, tangible monopoly on the single most important commodity on the planet. And in 1324, he decided to take a large portion of it on a road trip. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim. Islam had spread along the trans-Saharan trade routes into West Africa over the preceding centuries, and Mali's rulers had adopted it. And one of the 5 pillars of Islam is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, that every able Muslim is obligated to undertake at least once. So in 1324, Mansa Musa set out from his capital to cross the Sahara, pass through Cairo, and reach the holy city of Mecca, roughly 4,000 miles away. He was not going to travel quietly. He was going to travel as the richest man on earth, and he was going to make sure everyone he passed understood it. The scale of the pilgrimage caravan is where history starts to sound like exaggeration. The sources describe a column of 60,000 people, 12,000 servants, each, according to some accounts, dressed in fine Persian silk and brocade, and each carrying a staff of solid gold. 500 heralds went ahead of the king, each bearing a golden staff weighing several pounds. And the gold itself, the spending money for the journey, was carried by a baggage train of camels and by hundreds of servants, each hauling sacks of raw gold dust. The most cited figure is roughly 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold. Do that multiplication, and you are carrying tens of thousands of pounds of pure gold across a desert as walking around money. In July of 1324, after months crossing the desert, Mansa Musa and his caravan arrived at the outskirts of Cairo, the largest and richest city in the Islamic world. Cairo in 1324 was a global capital. It was the seat of the Mamluk Sultanate, a hub of trade, scholarship, and luxury, a city that had seen the wealth of half the world pass through its markets. Cairo was not easily impressed. Mansa Musa impressed it so thoroughly that they were still writing about him a century later. An Egyptian official named Al-Umari, who visited Cairo 12 years after Musa passed through, found the city still talking about the African king, and he recorded what the locals told him. When Musa arrived, the Mamluk Sultan Al-Nasser Muhammad invited him to court. And here, the first sign of the king's pride appears. Court protocol required visitors to the Sultan to prostrate themselves and kiss the ground. Mansa Musa, a sovereign in his own right, did not want to bow to another king. He resisted for some time. Eventually, a compromise was found. He prostrated himself, but declared he was bowing to God, not to the Sultan. This was a man who understood that he answered to no earthly power. He had the gold to back it up. And then Mansa Musa began to spend and give and give. He gave gold to the Sultan. He gave gold to the officials of the court. He gave gold to the holders of the royal offices, to the scholars, to the merchants, to the poor. As he moved through the city, he handed out gold to nearly everyone he encountered. He bought goods at the markets. And the sources insist, paid far above the asking price, apparently out of sheer generosity and pride. He spent so freely that by the time he left Cairo, his enormous treasury was running low, and he was actually borrowing gold from Cairo's merchants. At the end of his stay, he had given away a fortune large enough to bankrupt most kingdoms, almost as an afterthought. And this is where generosity became catastrophic. Cairo's economy, like every economy of the age, ran on gold. The value of gold in the city was set, as all prices are, by supply and demand. For generations, the supply of gold in Cairo had been relatively stable, which kept its value high. Then, in the space of a few weeks, one man flooded the entire city with a quantity of gold it had never seen arrive at once. He did not trickle it into the market. He dumped it, thousands of pounds of pure gold, poured directly into the hands of ordinary people, all at the same time. What happens to the value of anything when it suddenly becomes far more common? It collapses. This is the iron law of supply and demand. and it does not care about your intentions. The price of gold in Cairo crashed. By some accounts, the value of gold in Egypt fell by as much as 25%. And because gold was money itself, a collapse in the value of gold meant that the price of everything else, measured in gold, shot upward. Bread, cloth, grain, rent, all of it suddenly cost more gold than it had a month earlier. Mansa Musa had, without meaning to, triggered runaway inflation in the richest city in the Islamic world. And here is the cruelest part of the story. The people Musa thought he was helping, the poor and the merchants who received his gold, found that the gold in their hands was worth less and less every week. Their savings, their wages, their stored wealth, all of it measured in gold, lost value. His gift, handed out with genuine piety and generosity, quietly impoverished the very economy that received it. This is the paradox the entire episode turns on. He was not a tyrant, he was not a looter, he was by every account a generous and devout man, and his generosity functioned economically like an act of sabotage. Mansa Musa finished his Hajj, prayed at Mecca, and began the long journey home. But the wound he had opened in Cairo's economy did not close behind him. The inflation he triggered did not last a week or a season. It lasted, by the most cited accounts, roughly 12 years. The value of gold in Cairo and across the wider region remained depressed for more than a decade after he passed through. An entire generation of Egyptian commerce was conducted under the long shadow of one man's pilgrimage. 12 years of distorted prices, of merchants recalculating, of a market that could not return to where it had been because there was simply too much gold loose in the system, and it could not be ungiven. Now, some later historians have pushed back on the simplest version of this story, and we should be honest about that. Cairo's economy in this period had other pressures. Plague would come within decades. Trade fluctuated. Currency was debased for other reasons too. The gold crash was probably not caused by Mansa Musa alone, in a vacuum with no other factors. But the medieval sources are unanimous on one thing. The people of Cairo and the scholars who wrote about them believed that the African king's gold was the cause. They lived through it and they pinned it on him. When the people who were actually there agreed that one man's generosity broke their money, that testimony is worth taking seriously, even 1,000 years later. And on his way home, Mansa Musa learned something about money the hard way, realizing or being told that he had damaged the Egyptian economy and driven up prices. He tried to repair it. As he passed back through Cairo, he borrowed gold back from the city's lenders at high interest, deliberately pulling gold out of circulation to push its value back up. It is one of the earliest recorded instances of someone attempting, by instinct, what a modern central bank does on purpose, contracting the money supply to fight inflation. He had broken the economy by accident. He tried to fix it on his way out the door. It was, by most accounts, far too little to undo what 100 camelloads of gold had set in motion. This is the lesson that every powerful actor eventually learns and almost never expects. At sufficient scale, your good intentions stop mattering. When you are large enough, your smallest casual act lands on the world with the force of policy. Mansa Musa did not set out to manipulate Egypt's currency. He set out to be generous and pious on the road to Mecca. But a man carrying half the medieval world's gold cannot simply be generous. At that scale, generosity is monetary policy, whether he intends it or not. Mansa Musa returned to Mali, and you might think the story ends there. A generous king, a broken market, a strange footnote. But what flowed out of that pilgrimage reshaped how the world saw an entire continent. 4 downstream consequences came out of that single journey. Consequence 1, Mansa Musa put Mali and Africa onto the map of the world. Literally, before 1324, European map makers had only the vaguest sense of West Africa. After, the stories of Musa's pilgrimage spread up through the Mediterranean trading world. That changed. In 1375, a Spanish Jewish cartographer produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval period. And there, in the middle of West Africa, the mapmaker drew a black African king seated on a golden throne, holding an enormous gold nugget in one hand and a golden scepter in the other. The caption named him as the lord of the richest land of gold. That king was Mansa Musa. For the first time, Europe had a face and a name to attach to the source of its gold. One pilgrimage had dragged the hidden empire into the light of the wider world's imagination. Consequence 2. The pilgrimage turned Timbuktu into a legend and then into a reality. On his return journey, Mansa Musa brought back scholars, architects, and poets from across the Islamic world, including, by tradition, an Andalusian architect who designed grand structures in Musa cities. He poured resources into the city of Timbuktu, building mosques, and, crucially, fostering its growth into one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. At its height, Timbuktu's universities and libraries are said to have held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, and the city drew students and scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. The phrase that survives in English to this day, using Timbuktu to mean the most remote, exotic, far-off place imaginable, is a faded echo of a city that was once a blazing center of gold, books, and learning. Consequence 3. European appetite for African gold sharpened into obsession. The legend of an African king so rich he crashed Cairo's economy did not just inform European mapmakers. It motivated them. If that much gold lay at the southern edge of the Sahara, the question that began to burn in the courts and counting houses of Europe was, how do we reach it directly and cut out the Arab and Berber middlemen who control the desert routes? Within a few generations, Portuguese navigators began pushing their ships down the West African coast, looking for a sea route to the gold of Guinea. The same hunger that put Musa on the Catalan Atlas helped launch the age of exploration down the African coast, with all the gold, ivory, and eventually the human trafficking that came with it. The story does not stay clean. The gold that built Timbuktu's libraries also lit a fuse under European ambitions that would scar the continent for centuries. Consequence 4. The empire that produced him did not last. Mali reached its peak under Mansa Musa. He expanded its borders, enriched its cities, and made it famous across 3 continents. But after his death around 1337, the empire began a long, slow decline. Succession disputes weakened the throne. Subject peoples and rival powers chipped at the edges. By the 15th century, Mali was being supplanted by the rising Songhai Empire, which would seize Timbuktu and the gold trade for itself before it too eventually fell. The empire that briefly held more of the world's gold than anyone faded back into the very obscurity from which Mansa Musa's pilgrimage had so spectacularly pulled it. So pull back. What does this episode of history actually teach us? First, scale changes the rules. A small act of generosity helps a person. A vast act of generosity at the scale of a global gold supply distorts an entire economy. The same behavior that is virtuous at one size becomes destructive at another, and the actor often cannot feel the difference from the inside. Mansa Musa thought he was giving alms. He was functionally conducting monetary policy with his bare hands. Second, wealth and knowledge are not the same thing, and confusing them is dangerous. Mansa Musa controlled an almost incomprehensible fortune, but he did not understand until it was too late what dumping that fortune onto a market would do. He had power over the supply of money without understanding the mechanics of money. That gap between the power to act and the understanding of consequences is where most catastrophes in history are born. Third, history decides who it remembers. And it is not always fair. An African empire larger than Western Europe, sitting on half the world's gold with universities and libraries and a king richer than anyone before or since, was nearly erased from the story most of the world tells itself about the past. Mansa Musa survives in popular memory mostly because of one spectacular, accidental act of economic destruction. An entire sophisticated civilization shrank in global memory into a single viral anecdote about a man who gave away too much gold. The lesson is not just about him, it is about how much real history sits just out of frame in the blank spaces our maps used to label "here the gold grows." In the summer of 1324, a devout king walked into Cairo and gave away so much gold that he broke the value of money for 12 years. He did not mean to. That is what makes it unforgettable. By the time he reached Mecca, the legend of his wealth was racing ahead of him across the Islamic world. By 1375, European mapmakers were drawing him on a golden throne. And by the time Portuguese ships were nosing down the African coast in search of his gold, the empire that made him had already begun to fade back into the desert. The gold fields are mostly worked out now. The great libraries of Timbuktu were scattered, hidden, and partly lost over the centuries, though thousands of manuscripts still survive, smuggled and saved by families who refused to let them go. But the lesson Mansa Musa left in the ledgers of Cairo is permanent. When you become large enough, you lose the ability to act privately. Your kindness becomes weather, your generosity becomes policy. Your smallest gesture lands on the world with consequences you never intended and cannot take back. The richest man who ever lived learned that on the road to Mecca. One handful of gold at a time, in a city that was still talking about him 100 years after he passed through. If you want more episodes that walk through the full causal chain behind events you were never taught a word about, subscribe. There is a lot of history to explain,